Hello, welcome to the start sharing now. Okay. Hello, welcome to the Engaging Scientists and Engineers in Policy webinar, the R&D Budget 101. I'm Kate Stoll, Senior Policy Advisor for the MIT Washington office, and I'm here to introduce Matt Horahan of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and Matt Owens for the Association of American Universities. These guys are the two most knowledgeable R&D budget experts in DC, so you're in for a treat today. The budget and appropriation process is one of the most critical functions of the federal government. It's also the largest source of funding for basic research. That's why robust and sustained federal funding is really critical for the health of America's innovation enterprise. However, the budget and appropriation process can sometimes be a bit complicated and opaque. That's why we're lucky to have Matt and Matt here with us today to kind of explain that process and answer your questions. So with that, I'll turn it over to Matt Horahan of AAAS to start us off.
Okay, thank you, Kate. So I thought I would start things out by running through briefly running through some of the history and some longer-term trends regarding the federal R&D budget before we get into the 2017 fiscal year and appropriation cycle. So what you're seeing here is simply R&D. It's American R&D by funder as a share of the economy, as a share of GDP. And the composition of the national science and technology enterprise has changed quite a bit over the past few decades. If you go back to the 1960s during the space race, you can see the federal government was about 2/3 or 3/4 of national R&D expenditures. Industry was only about 1/3 or so. Over time, those proportions have changed dramatically. In the late 1970s, industry caught up with the federal government while federal expenditures declined. And as of today, the federal government only accounts for about 1/3 or so of national R&D expenditures. Industry accounts for about 2/3. And when I say national R&D expenditures today, we're up to around $450 billion or so in terms of funding for R&D. Now, however, you can see this chart, and you can see the decline in federal spending. It's important to remember that most of the decline on the federal side and most of the increase on the industry side is focused on development spending. And development spending, of course, tends to be much more short-term. We're not talking about fundamental science. When we strip out development and we only focus on research, on basic and applied research, you can see the picture is very different. The government was and remains the #1 source of research funding in the U.S. Industry is well behind. That other category, that includes universities, it includes state governments, it includes nonprofit research institutes. And again, the federal government remains the #1 source of research funding. And that's especially true, as Kate mentioned, regarding basic science. If we were to strip out applied research and focus only on basic research, far and away the federal government is the #1 source of funding. The federal government is also the #1 source, as Kate mentioned, of university funding for R&D. About 60% or so of university R&D is funded by the federal government. So this primacy of the federal government in the national science and technology space is a big reason why we focus so much on the federal science budget here in DC. The feds remain a major driver of the health and well-being of the national science and technology enterprise. So that's one reason why we focus on budgets. Another reason, of course, is what's been happening overseas. Now this chart, like the last one, simply shows research intensity, or R&D, as a share of the economy, organized by country. And the U.S., we remain the leader in total R&D funding. As I mentioned, we're around $450 billion in the most recent year, for which data is available. In terms of dollars, that's still way out in front. But in terms of the size of our R&D investments relative to the economy, things are not quite so good. We've made some progress over the past couple of decades. But you can see here plainly how much progress other countries have made, especially in Asia, regarding the research intensity of their economies. It means other countries are doing a good job, and perhaps a better job than us, of building innovation-oriented economies for the 21st century. You can see plainly, you can see how South Korea has done, how Japan has done, Taiwan, etc. Um, on this metric, I don't have every major economy shown here. On this metric, we are the U.S. ranks now 10th in the world in research intensity. We were recently surpassed by Germany. Not shown on this chart, I believe we were surpassed by Austria. Israel is ahead of us. Singapore, I believe, is ahead of us. So, and some of the Scandinavian countries as well. So we are in 10th place on this metric and declining. On this chart, of course, perhaps the scariest piece of it is China, what's been happening there. Again, the U.S. is out in front in terms of total dollars. As of 2014, the Chinese total Chinese R&D expenditures are about $368 billion. So they are gaining on us. The expectation is that China is going to surpass us in the next 5 to 7 years in terms of total R&D. And for a little bit of perspective on what it might take for us to keep that lead in total dollars. The most recent year for which data is available, China increased their R&D spending by 9%. Now that 9% increase, it's a major increase. It's actually the smallest increase in any single year for China going back a couple of decades. And China's had some economic difficulties. It remains to be seen whether they'll be able to continue growing or return to that double-digit growth, or whether they're going to stagnate a little bit. But if we take that 9% increase as the metric for the U.S., I mean that's a pretty tall order in terms of just research funding from the federal government. There's only been a handful of years where federal research expenditures have increased by at least 9%, going back a few decades. And so, and we'd have to go back to things like the NIH budget doubling to see increases in that magnitude. So that's a pretty tall order. And it's especially difficult given some of the challenges we're looking at here in Washington under the current spending cap regime. Now, of course, while China, you all know, while China's been increasing, we've actually been moving in the opposite direction for the last several years. This chart simply shows funding levels adjusted for inflation, represented as a percentage change from FY 2010 levels for some of the major science agencies. And I picked 2010 as the baseline because that's the year that federal R&D actually peaked. Since then, it's been all downhill. Now, 2013 was the sequester year, and you can see the impact that sequestration had in that 1 year on science agency budgets. But remember that by the time we got to sequestration, science budgets had already been coming down quite a bit for a few years. Once we got to 2013, once we got past sequestration, the funding levels for most major science agencies were down at least 10% below FY 2010 levels. And there are a lot of other agencies, of course, I'm not showing here that at which the budget trajectory has been similar. Now, fortunately, just in the past few years, things have begun to look a bit better. And the reason for that is, excuse me, some of the increases Congress has made to the discretionary budget. I've got the discretionary budget also displayed on this chart. It's the blue dotted line. Discretionary spending is incredibly important for federal R&D. R&D doesn't tend to change a whole lot as a share of the discretionary budget. So the size and the direction of movement in the discretionary budget overall tends to be a pretty good indicator of where science spending is going to go. Now, it's important to note that every year sequestration has been in place. So 2013, 14, 15, and 16, Congress has acted in some way to roll back the spending reductions under sequestration. And that has had a meaningful impact on science agency budgets. You can see, starting in FY 2014, immediately after the sequester, a lot of the big agencies began to recover. In FY 2016, we got perhaps the best news so far. Congress did reach a budget deal that increased spending in FY 2016 by over 5%, and that directly translated into some pretty major increases for science agency budgets. NIH got an over 6% increase in FY 2016, and the appropriations bill was just passed, of course, a few months ago. NIH got their big 6.6% increase. The Office of Science got a nearly 6% increase. We saw 7% increases for NASA, for competitive research at the Department of Agriculture. So coming out of this past year, in spite of the challenges of the past few years, we do seem to have some pretty positive momentum. Hopefully we can build on that coming up in the FY 2017 cycle. Unfortunately, there are some very real barriers to sustaining that momentum. And a big barrier, of course, is the lack of an increase in the discretionary budget for FY 2017. Now, hopefully, this chart, I'll try to understand what's going on here a little bit. Hopefully, you'll be able to understand it. So what I've got shown, again, this is total discretionary spending. This is the base discretionary budget. So it excludes war funding, it excludes hurricane relief, things like that. Just about all federal R&D lives in this discretionary budget. 99% or so of federal spending, literally, R&D spending lives in this discretionary budget. And I mentioned, the big cuts we've seen to sequestration. I mentioned the budget deal that was reached last year to increase spending in FY 2016 and FY 2017. Now, focus first on the two gray lines you see here. These are the two spending baselines that were put in place by the Budget Control Act. Now, the Budget Control Act, that's legislation passed in 2011 that first established the sequester. Now, I've got two spending baselines here. The higher one, the higher gray line, that's what we call the pre-sequestration baseline. That was kind of the starting point in the Budget Control Act. It capped spending. It said, here's initially where we're going to be. Basically, flat funding, plus a little bit over a decade. When sequestration kicked in, that set us, that basically ratcheted us down to this lower spending baseline, sequester level spending baseline. And that, again, is where the law originally required us, or once sequestration kicked in, that's where the law required us to be. Now, as I mentioned, Congress has, every year that these two baselines have been in place, Congress has basically kind of sent us somewhat down the middle. Congress has acted to raise the spending caps, get us a little bit closer to that pre-sequestration baseline. We have never gotten back to that point, but we've gotten closer than we may have if the original law had stayed in place. Now, under the most recent budget deal, which affects FY 2016 and FY 2017, we got a big increase in 2016. We're looking at flat funding before inflation for FY 2017, and that's again that could be a big obstacle to maintaining the momentum that we saw in FY 2016. And that's flat funding before factoring in inflation. So this chart adjusts for inflation. That's why it looks like a small decline in FY 2017. So again, that's a challenge. That's another reason why it's important that we try to keep the momentum going for science funding in FY 2017. Beyond FY 2017, I should also point out, of course, that the budget deal, the current budget deal under which we're operating, it expires. So starting in FY 2018, as of right now, we're back to that sequestration level spending baseline in FY 2017, FY 2018 and beyond. It's possible Congress could pass another deal in a year that gets us away from that sequestration level baseline. But for now, these are very real challenges, and this is something that the community has to deal with going forward. The last kind of general point I'll make about spending is that this chart, this discretionary budget, is only about a third of the federal budget. The federal budget is dominated by what's called mandatory spending. And mandatory spending is basically the big entitlement program, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Now, the Congressional Budget Office expects that those programs are going to continue growing over the next several years, talking decades. And those programs have been growing over some decades already. So that has meant a squeeze on the discretionary budget. What it comes down to is that the community has to fight over a smaller and smaller slice of the overall federal pie. So again, that's another challenge that we're looking at, and again, another reason why engagement with policymakers on science funding is incredibly important, because there are lots of other folks that have other priorities for the federal budget, and it's important that we make sure that we're well represented. Now, the last thing I'll talk about briefly is FY 2017, where we are now, where we're going to be going. Then I'll turn it over to Matt, and he's going to talk a little bit more about what we might see over these next several months. So when we talk about the federal budget process, every year, of course, the starting point for federal spending and the federal budget debate is always in February, usually, when the president releases his budget. He's required by law to release his budget request in early February. and so we'll be getting the budget on February 9th. We know the administration has already said they're going to be prioritizing climate research, advanced manufacturing, neuroscience, advanced computing, low carbon energy. These have been priorities for many years, and will likely continue to be a priority for this final budget. And I should add too, this is the final budget that President Obama himself will be releasing. So we know that those areas will probably be prioritized to some extent. We know they're going to ask for a big boost for cancer research, for computer science education. The president is going to be asking for a big increase in transportation funding, funded through fees on oil imports. So once we get the president's budget, then the action really turns to Congress. The president can only ask for funding, but it's Congress that has the constitutional authority to actually appropriate dollars. The annual tradition, of course, is that once the president's budget is released, the opposing party pronounces it dead on arrival, and I fully expect that'll be the case again this year. Now, the next step in the process, or the first step in the process for Congress, is passing a budget resolution. The budget resolution is basically the congressional budget. It sets a target for overall discretionary spending. It's actually not entirely clear whether Congress is going to pass a budget resolution this year. It's kind of an open question, especially in the Senate, although the House seems much more interested in passing budget resolution. Odds are pretty good. In fact, I'm going to go back to the prior slide just for a moment. Odds, I think, are pretty good that we're going to end up at this FY 2017 level you see here, that the budget deal that was reached last fall will continue to remain in place for FY 2017. However, there is a lot of interest from a minority of Republicans in Congress in trying to bring that spending down even further. Republican leadership is not in favor of this. It's certainly not in favor of this, but it's something to keep an eye on. That is one of the big debates, going to be one of the big debates going forward. After we get through the budget resolution, if there is one, the next step is appropriations. Now, to fund government, to fund the discretionary budget and fund science agencies, Congress has to write and pass 12 different spending bills or appropriations bills. And those bills originate in the appropriations committees. Some very, very important players in this process are the chairs of the appropriations subcommittees. There's 24 chairs in total, 12 in the House, 12 in the Senate. Each of them can have their own set of priorities. Many of them are going to disagree with the president on many issues, although many issues they may find some common ground on, certainly. Especially regarding science, there are plenty of areas of agreement on the science funding front, although certainly not perfect agreement. Typically, spending bills really start to get going, markups and hearings and whatnot really start to get going in around the May timeframe. This year, it looks like we're going to be getting a somewhat more aggressive timetable for spending bills. House Speaker Paul Ryan has said he wants to see the House finished with appropriations by July. That maybe is a more aggressive timetable than we might really, than might really happen. But it's entirely possible we're going to start seeing appropriations bills in the March timeframe to start out at least. But again, we'll see what happens there. And again, these, the appropriations committees, the importance of them is not to be underestimated. There are plenty of appropriators and appropriations subcommittee chairs who do favor certain areas of the science budget. NIH, NASA, et cetera, have their champions. But again, engagement in this process from folks on the outside, like yourselves, is incredibly important. So with that summary of some trends and what we're going to be looking at going forward, I will turn it over to Matt, and he'll walk you through some other things we want to watch out for over the next few months.
And I just wanted to remind our viewers before we turn it over to Matt Owens that you can type your questions into the webinar, and we will answer them at the end of both presentations.
Thank you, Matt. Many of my comments are going to pick right up right where Matt left off. I'm going to focus on sort of the political situation and expand a little bit more on the process of the budget and some pathways that we may see, and how the scientific community is planning to engage in the advocacy around all of this. But before I get into that, I'd like to just show you, set the political stage a little bit. This first chart you see on your screen looks at party polarization and trends over time, and I think it sort of speaks for itself. It doesn't come all the way up to 2016, but what I can assure you is that the trend holds, and that the difference between the parties that is very significant. Moving on to this next chart I'd like to show you is talking about legislative gridlock, the ability of Congress to actually pass laws and move things through the legislative process. Again, you can see that things are at a pretty much a historic high, and the trend over time has been one of greater gridlock than cooperation. And finally, I'd like to show you this slide. It contemplates congressional job approval. What this is public opinion polls doing a composite average of all of these and putting out what the public thinks of the job Congress is doing. I looked up this morning what the actual average is today, and that is 14.2%. As you can see, that's pretty low and near historic lows over time. So that's the political context that undergirds budget process that Matt began laying out for us here. The other part of the political situation, of course, is this is a presidential election year, and everybody in the House is up for re-election or election, and we have at least a third of the Senate that is up for election as well. So there's a lot of incentive to demonstrate in Washington that each party can govern and that members are doing their jobs. So that's especially true for Republicans because they control both the House and the Senate, as you're probably well aware. They want to demonstrate now that they have the reins in both chambers that they can move their priorities and govern effectively, and maybe that translates into the White House victory in 2016. For Democrats, it's much of the same. They want to show that they can be effective and so effective in the minority that they can actually be more effective in the majority if they were to be elected. And again, all of this undergirds budgets because budgets are always a reflection of priorities. So there is a strong incentive to get some things done, but there's always a political calculation. For science and STEM education, what we've always found is that it's never partisan. There's bipartisan support across the Congress for this, and usually over time there's never really been much fluctuation. Now there are at times partisan disputes about certain areas of science. I think you're well aware of those, and maybe what sciences might be have more federal investment than say others. But generally speaking, science and STEM education actually have really broad bipartisan support. So thinking about the FY17 budget, Matt made a very important point that I want to reinforce. Looking at the overall discretionary spending level cap, it is effectively the same, and with inflation, it is actually lower. So that puts enormous pressure from the get-go of the budget process on how can you see potential increases for any program that the federal budget funds, including, of course, science and what we're interested in. Matt alluded to a small faction of the House Republicans that are making noise about not adhering to that budget cap and actually lowering it. That's the so-called Freedom Caucus. They have 40 or so members. They were instrumental in the change in the speakership in the last fall, and as such, they're making a lot of noise now. It's unclear where that will go. I think Matt correctly points out there's a good chance that things will stay in place in terms of that cap, because if anything, the Senate is not interested in lowering that overall discretionary spending cap. We could, in theory, see two tracks. The House may, in fact, lower its cap, and it will then proceed to mark up appropriations bills under that cap, and the Senate won't adhere to that, and they'll mark up their own legislation and consider that in the appropriations process. And so there'll be large discrepancies in the amounts funded in a particular bill, say for the National Science Foundation, and perhaps in the House versus that in the Senate, because the overall total just doesn't allow for an increase one way or the other. So looking at this, though, if we wind up having this situation, we could see some very overt political calculations made as, do we want to resolve this before the election, or we want to wait, see the outcome of the election, and then have Congress make some decisions. If the caps were to hold, there's a fair chance that we'll see some appropriations bills move and actually approved before the election. If they don't hold, in the situation I just outlined, many won't. We'll see ourselves on a so-called continuing resolution, which means funding at the current level will continue until such time Congress makes an affirmative decision and comes back and makes a final decision. So we could see a continuing resolution for a short period of time, say after the election, and then come back and make some potential changes. We also risk the chance of that they'll just have a continuing resolution for the entire fiscal FY17 year because they can't resolve issues. And the easiest thing to do is allow everything to operate the same way it has, at the same levels, and let the next Congress and the next president think ahead to the next year. That's a realistic possibility. There is sort of a third possibility. I think it's unlikely, but you could see that they do a short-term continuing resolution into the next administration, say till early spring. We've seen this in the past. And then the new Congress and the new president look at the total discretionary spending levels and determine if they can cut a deal that allows funding to move forward, perhaps with increases, perhaps with decreases, depending on who's in control. That's an unlikely scenario. But one thing we've learned in Washington when it comes to budgets, you never say never, because it's been very unpredictable. For all of the political reasons I outlined at the beginning. People want to show that they can govern and they want to advance their priorities. I want to take just a few minutes before I close my comments to talk a little bit about where advocacy and the scientific research community is going forward. Our goal with the current caps in place is that we want to make science and STEM education a priority for members of Congress. Very, very simply. So whether it's the cap we have now, and ideally a higher cap if things were to cut a different way, or even a lower cap. No matter what, our goal is to make science a priority within the members' minds, so that when they have to make the tough choices between, say, social welfare program and the National Institutes of Health, we hope that they'll come out on the positive side for the National Institutes of Health and find other ways to take care of some of these other valuable programs in that labor, HHS, and education bill. The community now is working cooperatively to develop very specific funding recommendations for each of the major federal scientific agencies, whether that's the National Institutes of Health, the National Science Foundation, the Department of Defense Research Programs, the USDA's AFRI program, and NIST and NASA, and so many more that you're well aware of. So as we work on those specific funding recommendations, those are calibrated about what was received last year, and of course, what the president offers next week, and of course, what we'd like to see in an ideal world that we believe is sustainable. Part of that, of course, is how do you make science a priority once you have funding recommendation levels? So, the key goal always is to engage in each step of the budget process. So, Matt just talked about the budget resolution. We want to engage in that budget resolution process. Sometimes you can find expressions of priority for different elements of the federal budget. If there's an opportunity, we'd love to see an expression of priority for science in that. So we'll look for those opportunities. There's that so-called 302B allocation process. This is just a fancy name for what happens when you have that total number of discretionary spending and how that is then allocated to the various appropriations subcommittees. And within that, we want to make sure that the science agencies that are funded by the various subcommittees, that the allocation is robust enough that we could actually see an increase in investment in the agencies that we care most about. There's a process that the Appropriations Committee engages in each year in which they ask members of Congress for their priorities. Where would they like to see what are the members' priorities for investments and spending in the federal budget for the given year? And they ask for so-called programmatic requests. And it's a process that most members of Congress engage in, and they deliver those to the Appropriations Committee. We in the advocacy community and the research community, what we ask our members to do, we do this through universities and scientific societies, they work with their members of Congress to express and say, give those funding recommendations we developed, and ask that a member of Congress tell the Appropriations Committee that, for instance, the National Science Foundation should see an increase of X, whatever that funding recommendation level was. And hopefully that member then puts that into the appropriations process, and we can build enough support. That's one way you help to prioritize that agency and science generally. Beyond that, of course, there are the formal consideration of each spending bill. So at the subcommittee, at the committee level, and then, of course, on the floor of the House and Senate. So we try to work those processes as well, so that if there are amendments and opportunities to improve funding for those agencies, we seek to do that, and things of that nature. Related to all of this is what undergirds all of that advocacy is, of course, doing some of the straightforward things. And that is meeting with members of Congress and their staff, and the Appropriations Committee in particular. We look for opportunities by a variety of messengers to use the op-ed pages. That can be from scientists, students, to industry leaders, and others who are active and interested in science and research and STEM education funding. And finally, we look for ways using social media and just straight up letter writing and things, emailing, to, again, encourage members to make our matters a priority. One of the things we're trying to emphasize, again, this year is engaging industry voices, and that of graduate students and others engaged in research. We know Congress loves to hear from students. They love their enthusiasm. They love to hear what's new and exciting and their vision and the vision of these young scientists. So that we're always trying to find ways to connect young scientists to members of Congress. And on industry, I think always values and understands that investments in scientific research are important, and they provide in many ways the seed corn that allows them to then commercialize those things and run their operations and make a profit. But the enthusiasm of industry sometimes waxes and wanes. What we're seeing currently is, I think, greater enthusiasm for making federal investments in research a priority, and we want to help bolster that voice and show that there's cross sort of industry sector support for increasing these investments. So with that, that's just a brief picture of sort of the politics, where things may go, ways in which this community will engage. And I think I'll close here and just note there has been a sort of cross-sector effort that was started last year called Innovation and American Imperative. It is a document that lays out a number of recommendations that include funding recommendations and other things related to science policy and tax policy that would be useful to reestablishing the United States as the global innovation leader and maintaining our spot there. This document was led by 10 CEOs of industry. It has organizational endorsements from over 340 industry, individual company, university, and scientific societies. We're trying to give you a visual right now of it. It's a little tough because it's a big document, but I encourage you to take a look at this document. It can be found at innovationimperative.org. And again, it gives you a little flavor of how communities are rallying around science. And I point you for this point of this webinar to the first recommendation that speaks to federal investments in science and research, and specifically looking for at least a 4% real increase, so with inflation factored in, for the major scientific agencies. So with that, I'll turn it back to Kate.
All right, great. Thank you both for great presentations. We have some questions from the viewers. One that came in from a couple people at least was, why isn't science funding moved to the mandatory spending part of the budget? And if, since it's not, how could it be? I mean, what do you guys think about that? I'll start with you, Matt H.
Sure. Yeah. So it's important to note there actually have been quite a few proposals recently to fund portions of the R&D budget through the mandatory side of the equation. We know the president has already said in next week's budget they're going to propose $350 million of mandatory spending for competitive grants at the Department of Agriculture through the AFRI initiative. There have been lots of proposals on the mandatory side for NIH to 21st Century Cures, which would it's already through the House. It would add almost $2 billion a year to the NIH budget. Again, all mandatory spending. And there are other similar kinds of proposals like that. The problem, one of the problems anyway, is that budgeting is about power, and in some ways, and when you've got an agency that lives off of the discretionary budget, that gives appropriators the power over that agency's budget. Taking, the National Science Foundation, for example, it's entirely discretionary. Taking that out of the discretionary budget, dropping into the mandatory budget, means appropriators have less power over what happens with the agency's budget year to year, and that is a big roadblock. Appropriators are powerful individuals that like having that power. It means they can fight for their constituents' interests in a very direct fashion by trying to bring home the dollars. And taking an agency out of the discretionary budget, giving it a 3 or 4 or 5 year mandatory appropriation, can be seen as interfering with that power. And that's one reason why appropriators often resist those kinds of proposals. The other thing I should add too is that mandatory spending is often multi-year. That's another piece of this. I mean, it's not as though mandatory spending that simply has to be re-upped every year is a lot different from discretionary spending, but in some ways. But so giving an agency a 3 or 4 or 5 year mandatory spending is basically on autopilot, and that has implications for the power that appropriators have over agencies. That's a part of it. I don't know if you had anything you want to add.
Yeah, I agree with everything Matt has said, and I think I would simply add to pick up on that last point, Matt, and the fact that it's automatic. Then that doesn't allow for the expression of priority at times. And so where we might want to see particular investments made in certain areas of science, more so than others, to meet national priorities, whether they be health or security or energy or whatever, then there has to be a process put in place for that. The other part of it I would say too is that most mandatory spending in the federal government are related to so-called entitlements, that individuals are entitled to these because they have paid into that, they are a U.S. citizen or have are entitled to some of these benefits. It sort of changes the thinking in the equation, and frankly, conservatives are not interested currently in expanding so-called mandatory spending. There are some rare exceptions, and Matt has noted a few where there is some nascent interest in Congress to figure out how we might make science such a priority that we would have mandatory spending. But politically, it's a really tough sell at this point.
All right, so we have another question about advocacy, and Matt Owens, you touched on this, how the science and the R&D advocacy community is doing a lot on these issues already. And you also briefly touched on what students can do, op-eds, writing your congressperson, etc. But what's the most important thing you can do as a viewer to influence the budget process? And is it better to advocate for R&D and science overall, science and engineering overall, or for your own specific discipline?
Great question. Two things that come to mind, especially for scientists, young and old. One is definitely engage. Write your member of Congress. Recognize their activities on social media, especially as they relate to science funding. Encourage them. If they're a member, say, of the Appropriations Committee, and they voted for an increase for the National Science Foundation as it advances in the appropriations process, send them a thank you tweet. Use their Twitter handle. They want to see that. They watch these. They watch social media very, very closely. It's instant feedback, and we want to generate and encourage that type of activity. Letters to the editor are an extraordinarily effective way to get the attention of members of Congress, especially when you're thanking members of Congress for their actions. Again, along the same way I was talking about the use of social media. In every congressional office, there is somebody who the first thing they do in the morning is look at the local papers the national papers, and they're looking for mention of their boss's name in there, the actions they've taken, things of that nature. And if there's a letter to the editor that talks about, mentions their name, that automatically makes it time. Additionally, they're looking for what are the issues that are most interesting on the opinion pages of their local papers. So again, to the degree you can engage a letter editor or even an op-ed, if you can get to the get past the editors, that I think is a fantastic way. Now, to the second part of the question about should you be specific or general, I don't think it's either or. I think you can do both. And what do I mean by that is there needs to be a general message, I would argue, that science is a priority. And federal investments in science is a priority. So you would lead with that, and then you can give specific examples, whether it's the National Institutes of Health or the National Science Foundation. To achieve our national priorities, whether they are in health, security, energy, the environment, you actually need a mix of all the disciplines. So I tend to favor folks delivering the general message and then give them a specific example, and if it's a member of Congress, showing them how they can engage. So if they are on the appropriations subcommittee for that funds the National Institutes of Health, then make sure they know that that's one step they can take.
All right. This question is, we'll send it to you, Matt H. Can you explain authorization versus appropriation?
Okay. Yes. So authorizations are basically the authorizations. Authorizations are pieces of legislation to create, change, modify programs. Authorizations do not provide funding. They can provide funding targets or ceilings, but they don't actually allocate funding. The appropriations bill, that's the mechanism through which Congress actually allocates the funding. Now, under House and Senate rules, programs are supposed to have an authorization before an appropriation. And those have been rules on the books for over 150 years or so in both chambers. The idea is that, appropriators already have, they've got the power of the purse. They shouldn't be able to also create programs and then fund them. So the idea behind separating an authorization from an appropriation is that it distributes the power a little more evenly across other folks and other committees in Congress. What this basically means is that if you want to say, let's say you want to create a new program, the first thing you got to do is get an authorization passed. Department of Energy shall establish a new program focusing on transformational innovation in energy technology. And that's what happened with ARPA-E in the Department of Energy. They got their authorization as part of the America Competes Act of 2007. But it took them another 3 years to actually get an appropriation. So they existed on paper, basically had no money until the Recovery Act in 2009. So that's the main difference between the two. Appropriations are what actually provide funding. Authorizations create, change, modify programs, and authorizations can say, a given agency may receive up to 200 million or 500 million or a billion or whatever from appropriators, but authorizations don't actually provide that funding. That's kind of a simplified explanation, but pretty close. So.
All right, I'll direct this next question at you, Matt Owens. So, what changes, if any, do you anticipate with the 2016 election? So, we're going to have a new president in the White House. You don't have to predict who that will be. However, if you could give some generalizations about how that might fare for STEM and STEM education.
Well, I think it does relate directly to the topic of this webinar, and that is the budget. As Matt indicated, since we had the implementation of the baselines of funding for the discretionary spending, whether that's sequester level or pre-sequester levels, what we see is Congress act every couple of years to adjust those, and we found a place somewhere in the middle. All of that stemmed from, and some may recall this, the notion of a grand budget deal, where President Obama was negotiating, particularly with former Speaker Boehner, on some larger agreement that not only addressed discretionary spending, but addressed, as Matt indicated earlier, some of the entitlement spending and actually taxes. And we've seen little chunks done. Many people in Washington were watching very closely as whether 2017 is the year they may try to reattempt a significant larger budget deal, not these little 2-year deals, but something that goes multi-year that in theory would replace the discretionary spending caps that are in place and put us on a better trajectory, and at the same time reform taxes so that the revenue comes in at a rate that folks believe is necessary to cover federal expenses and reduce deficits, and perhaps reform some of the mandatory spending programs so that they're not quite as costly over time. The projections, if you've never seen them, I recommend you look at them. They are scary for how much federal spending will grow, particularly in the mandatory side of the budget. And so there is a reckoning that is coming, and the question is, well, in 2017, will they address that? So that's what I'm looking for personally, and I think many others are, is when we have a new president, and it's regardless of party, and will we have a different power structure in Congress? Will perhaps the Senate move to Democratic power and the House remain Republican? That's one scenario that many believe is likely. Under any scenario of who's in control, the question is, will they decide that the budget, tax reform in particular, appropriations, and mandatory spending, will that be a priority? There's a fair chance that that will happen, and that will set a trajectory about what spending patterns will be in this country. So the work we do here at FY17 to make science a priority actually has larger implications for where we're going to go in calendar year 2017 and what could be a very significant budget debate, whether it's grand in size and whatever definition you want to apply to that, or even it's just another 2-year deal. We know that science needs to be a priority if we're going to be able to, again, meet some of the challenges that we know exist for our country.
Okay, Matt Herhan. So, what level of investment will the U.S. need to make in R&D in order to maintain its global lead in science? You said that China was increasing their investment by 9% last year. We weren't at that level. What do you think we need to do to maintain
so I mean, it depends on, right now we have the lead. We will for another 5 or 6 years or so if current trends continue. Again, if China, if the Chinese rate of growth stays at, let's say it stays at 9%, that would mean we would need at least 9% increases in the U.S. On both federal and the federal and the industrial side, which is another challenge. But again, 9% increases every year on the federal front, at least a 9% increase. That's about 12 or 13 billion or so more a year for federal spending. That's the pace it would take to keep us ahead of China, assuming Chinese R&D grows at that 9% rate a year. Now, if China slows down, and they may, things get a little bit easier. Something else to keep in mind about China, though, is that while there are lots of scary numbers we can look at within China and their investment levels, but that their S&T system does have a lot of challenges that they're trying to work through. They don't have the level of real kind of fundamental innovative activity hasn't quite risen yet to the level that we see in the U.S. or other industrialized countries in the West and the East. What's really scary about China isn't how much they're spending; it's how committed they seem to be in improving how they spend it. In their science enterprise, there are some problems with fraud and favoritism and bureaucracy in the Chinese government. A lot of the expenditures are coming from state-owned enterprises that are not the most innovative in the world. But in the current 5-year plan for China, they've got some and they proposed some policy changes that will, in theory, put them more on a decision-making footing, on a science footing that's a little bit more on par with Western practice. And so, to me, that's even if Chinese investment ends up slowing down, the challenge is there either way. They're only going to get better either in quantity or in quality or both. And so, to me, that's the real reason why increasing federal investments in science needs to be a major priority because of the size and the scale of that challenge coming out of China. So.
All right. Well, we'll go back to Matt Owens. When's the best time to reach out to Congress in order to influence budget decisions?
Always.
Always.
That's the short answer. And I don't mean to be flip, but now's an especially good time right after the president releases his budget. It's an opportunity because now budget's first and foremost on their minds. But I say always in the sense that it's always important throughout the entire process, and I laid out a number of those stages to weigh in. Additionally, even after the process is over, we just spent time here at the Association of American Universities writing a large number of thank you letters to members of Congress. You know, they need to be recognized for what they did. Last year, as indicated, 2016 was a good year for science. We saw, hopefully, a righting of the ship, and perhaps we're going to see some momentum, despite all the challenges we've outlined, where we can actually get ourselves on a better pathway to see sustained increases. And in some ways, this connects to the previous question. You know, what's the right level of investment? What do we know about science and discovery, and how you take care of this when you have sustained funding increases that are at least at the level of inflation, but even a little bit more? What do we see? We see steady science. We see people who are interested in going into science. They know they have a career path because they know there are opportunities there that they can go compete for those monies and have a good career. And then industry has a reliable source of ideas coming and then intellectual property that can transfer. So again, I'll point you back to the Innovation and American Imperative statement and look at that, where it says at least 4%, again, including inflation growth. If we stay on that pathway, perhaps we can even do better year to year, but if we stay at a minimum at that level, well, we'll be on the pace that we need to compete, where other countries will have their fluctuations from time to time.
Great. So some of our viewers want to know about additional good resources in addition to this webinar now for newbies to learn more about the budget process. So Matt Harhan, I think you have an answer to that question.
Yeah, several answers. So maybe your first stop at a basic level, check out. So if you go to the SSS R&D Budget and Policy Program website, I don't know if we can make
It'll
that.
be in the next
one. Okay, so on our website, on the very front of our site, there's a link there. It says Federal Budget. I think it's Budget Process 101. It's just a very short explanation that we put together actually a few years ago now on the federal budget process, how it actually works, how it fits together. So we've got that. We've also I give a lot of presentations on the budget process 101. So there are lots of slide decks on our website as well. You can download and kind of look through those that contains additional info on and a lot more detail on the federal budget process. So we've also got some webinars and other things that we've put together in the past. Yeah, I'm trying to think other good resources. You guys have. What do you guys have? Anything
I would just point to another organization called the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities. They spend a lot of time talking about the budget process. So again, it's an organization here in Washington. It's a nonprofit think tank that thinks about these issues. And there are a number of groups like that where they really do lay out that budget process for you.
And I think if you really want to get deep on this stuff, I think I'd argue the single best book that's been written on the federal budget process. Author's name is Schick, S-C-H-I-C-K. And I think the title of the book is, I forget, it's Federal Budgeting, or I don't remember exactly. But if you look up Federal Budget Schick, you'll find it pretty quickly on Amazon. It's a great resource. It's a great book. I pick it up frequently when I need a refresher on what the heck Congress is doing. So
we have just a few minutes left, but I wanted to give you each a few minutes to kind of give us a brief background of, how did you get into this field, and any short advice for our viewers if they're interested in pursuing similar careers.
Sure. So I'm the Vice President for Federal Relations and Administration here at the Association of American Universities. I graduated with a degree in English. I was very interested in higher education policy, and my undergraduate institution was UC Davis, and it was a research university, and I learned a lot about what happens at a research university. And though I'm not a scientist, I've always had an appreciation for it. So fast forward, I came to Washington looking to work in higher education policy in some way and hopefully have an opportunity to work on science policy as part of that. I interned on Capitol Hill for a senator's office and got exposure to how the legislative process worked. And simultaneously, I actually secured a staff assistant position here at AAU. And I began working on legislation and tracking what's going on in the federal government and policies and things of that nature. I later pursued graduate work in public administration. I used that as a platform to secure a position in government relations at Stanford University, where again I got to work on all these sets of issues that we're talking here today, and many other issues affecting higher education, whether that be student financial aid to tax policy and things of that nature. And I was fortunate to come back to AAU about 14 years ago, and again I've held various positions engaging in policy in different ways. And one of the key things all along the way is, of course, I enhance my education, but through the process is looking for opportunities and sitting down with individuals who have expertise, whether it was on policies affecting the National Science Foundation or policies affecting intellectual property and patents and things of that nature, and finding those people and sitting down with them and learning from them, participating in things like these webinars where they were on a specific topic or a budget process, and really advancing and using a network. One thing I learned is, as I've gone through my career, I've mentored a number of interns. Internships are a fantastic way to get your foot in the door. So if you're interested in this area, I encourage you, seek opportunities. AAU offers internships. Many organizations do here in Washington. If that's a pathway, look at this. There are fellowships if you're at a little more senior level. But use those opportunities and always want to learn. I think that's how you sort of find a pathway in all of this.
For me, it's a pretty simple story. So my background is not in science or technology. It's in journalism and communications. And my first few jobs in DC were working in communications shops for different organizations and NGOs. Getting engaged in policy fights and advocacy and elections and things like that. Pretty early on, I knew I wanted to focus on science policy and technology policy, partly because it's pretty obvious from the start that there are very few issues. There are lots of issues I care about personally, and none of them lack some kind of a connection or relationship with science and technology. Originally, I think I moved into this space out of an interest in low carbon energy technologies as a pathway to deal with climate change. So after 4 or 5 years working in DC for different organizations, I went back to school, got a master's in S&T policy, and then while in grad school, I picked up internships and fellowships. Most importantly for me, I got an internship at AAAS, and after I finished my degree, a couple years later, I saw AAAS had an opening. I came back, and here I am. I don't know that I have much great advice. I mean, certainly echo everything Matt said. Internships, fellowships, engagement. I mean, engaging on every level that you can, as actively as you can, is important. Some folks will move into science policy as a career. Some folks will simply keep it as an important kind of a side activity to your day job. But engaging, and I'd also recommend writing, writing as much as you can. Whether it's letters to the editor, whether it's finding avenues for blogging and things like that. The ability to write well is an important one, and it shouldn't be underestimated. When I'm looking to hire, hire staff, the first skill I look for often is ability to write well. So that's, I wouldn't discount that skill.
All right, great advice. So we just have 1 minute left, so if you could spend 10, 15, 20 seconds with a final message about the budget to our viewers, really briefly.
So I know you've heard a lot of bad news and a lot of mediocre news. It's important to remember that in spite of some of the challenges that we've had over the past several years, and it may shock you to hear this, science and technology funding has actually done better than almost every other part of the discretionary budget. Entitlement programs continue to grow, and they're kind of their own animal, and they're going to continue growing. But within the discretionary space, science and technology has done relatively well, and I think that's certainly a testament to the fact. Earlier we talked about keeping a unified message and advocating for science in general or your discipline in particular. I think the fact that the community has kept a broad-based, unified front has played a big role in achieving those relatively positive results. And I think it also is grounds for optimism going forward. Even though we're looking at flat funding in FY 2017 and a problematic situation beyond, there does remain support in Congress for at least certain areas of the S&T enterprise. And so there are reasons for optimism there. Well, I guess I'll leave it there. So.
Scientists and engineers are optimists, so are advocates. They have that in common. And that is absolutely critical to the budget and legislative processes that affect science. So harness that enthusiasm, harness that optimism, and engage. I think that simply is the message I'd like to leave with all of you today.
All right. Well, thank you both, Matt and Matt, for being here. Thanks to our viewers. Remember that you can go on and fill out the poll at the end of this webinar so we can get on the webpage. So check out AAAS's webpage. Thank you.
Thank you.